The passport arrived across a desk and I held it for the length of one afternoon, long enough to see my own face in it, my name in typed letters, a destination I had never seen and could not yet believe in. Then I handed it back because that was the procedure, and it went into the Enterprise safe and I went home on the tram. 4 days before Vienna, Ionescu appeared at the lab door with the same tone as before. End of shift, his office, and I knew from the specific quality of his not looking at me that the news had changed direction. He told me there had been a modification in the composition of the delegation, a ministry-level decision. He was sorry. He would need to take back the documentation. The passport, he said, was already being returned to the relevant department. I had never held it at home, never taken it on the tram. It had lived in the Enterprise safe since the day they showed it to me, and still its disappearance was total, because what disappeared was not the document but the version of myself that had been waiting inside it. My name is Elena Munteanu. I was born in 1951 in Cluj-Napoca in a 2-room apartment on Strada Horea, where the stairwell smelled of damp concrete and boiled vegetables, not as a complaint, just a fact. My father worked the night shift at the CFR depot, checking freight manifests until his eyes went red. My mother sat at her Singer sewing machine until midnight, turning collars and hemming skirts for the neighbors. The earliest clear thing I remember is standing in the courtyard of my primary school in 1957, watching a teacher pin a portrait of Georgiu Dej to the wall above the blackboard. She used 4 thumbtacks, one for each corner, and I watched every adult in that room, the teacher, the janitor, the woman who brought the milk, arrange their faces into the same expression. Not joy, not fear, something rehearsed between the two, like a muscle they had trained to hold a particular shape. I didn't know what it meant then. I just knew it was important. My father's shift schedule was the rhythm of our house. He came home at 6 in the morning, slept until 2, ate a plate of soup my mother had kept warm on the stove, and then sat at the kitchen table with his identity booklet, that red cover, worn soft at the corners, and a glass of tea in a metal holder. He never talked about work, not the manifests, not the quotas, not the men he worked with. Once when I was maybe 9, I asked him what he did all night. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I check papers." That's all. And I knew not to ask again. My mother's sewing machine was the other heartbeat of the apartment. She made alterations for half the women on our floor. A dress taken in, a skirt let out, a winter coat turned inside out and resewn so it looked almost new. She charged in eggs or sugar or a jar of pickled peppers because no one had money to spare. I remember the paper bag of sugar on the kitchen shelf, rationed across a week. My mother would dip her finger in it sometimes, just a touch, and then close the bag carefully, folding the top 3 times. The pride of that coat, the one she had turned inside out, I wore it for 3 winters, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I owned because she had made it look like it had never been anything else. I became a lab technician because of a chemistry teacher in the 8th grade. Her name was Doamna Radu. She had gray hair pulled back tight, and a way of speaking that made you feel like your answer mattered. One afternoon after a titration experiment, she said to me, not to the class, to me, "You have a precise mind, Elena. Don't waste it." I didn't know what that meant exactly. But I understood, without anyone saying it aloud, that a girl from my background did not reach for the university places reserved for the children of party functionaries. Those places were not for me. I reached for what was reachable: the technical school, the chemistry program, the job at the enterprise. And I was good at it. Measuring viscosity, pH levels, solvent purity, there was a satisfaction in the numbers, in the clean line of a result that matched the norm. It was enough. For a long time, it was enough. I remember the year my father stopped speaking at dinner. That was 1956. He never explained why, but I knew. He had been at the depot when the news came from Budapest, the uprising, the tanks, the crack of it across the border. He came home that night and sat down at the table and did not say a word. My mother put a bowl of soup in front of him. He looked at it. He did not eat. And for 3 nights after that, he sat at the kitchen table with his tea and his identity booklet and stared at the wall. I was 5. I didn't know what Budapest meant, but I knew the shape of that silence. I knew it was not the same as the silence he used when he was tired. It was a different kind of quiet. A quiet that had weight, that pressed against the walls of our 2-room apartment. My mother never asked him about it. She just put the soup in front of him and waited. And that was how we lived, not with secrets exactly, but with things we did not need to say because we already knew them. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the texture of my beginning. Not as complaint, but as fact. The damp concrete, the rationed sugar, the silence that was not silence, the way my mother's hands moved over the sewing machine, turning fabric into something that would last another season, the way my father checked his identity booklet before he left for work every single night as if he were confirming that he still existed. I did not know then that these were political things. I thought they were just life. But life in Cluj-Napoca in the 1950s was already arranged around a system that did not need to announce itself. It was in the portrait above the blackboard. It was in the shift schedule. It was in the careful expression on every adult face in the school courtyard, that rehearsed thing between joy and fear. I learned to read that expression before I learned to read words, and I have been reading it ever since. So when I tell you that I became a lab technician because it was reachable, I mean that I understood, without being told, that the system had a ceiling and that I lived under it. I did not fight it. I did not even think of fighting it. I simply learned where the edges were, and I stayed inside them. That was not courage. It was not cowardice either. It was survival. And survival in that world meant learning to live in the space between what you wanted and what you were allowed to have. I had a precise mind. I used it to measure viscosity. That was enough for a long time. And then, in March of 1983, my direct supervisor, Chief Engineer Vasily Ionescu, appeared at the door of the Quality Control Lab, and he asked me to come to his office at the end of my shift. And I remember the exact quality of that request. Not urgent, not casual, something in between. Something that made me set down my pipette and look at him and wait. I remember the sound of the viscometer first. Not the machine itself, it was silent, but the glass rod settling into the clamp. A small click, like a tooth meeting a fork. That was my world for 11 years. Întreprinderea Chimiclage, Building 4, Quality Control. The room was long and narrow, with wooden shelves along one wall holding reagent bottles in rows so straight you could have drawn a line with a ruler. The bottles were never full. The reagents were never quite the concentration they should have been. But we recorded them as meeting the norm, because the norm was what we said it was, and what we said it was had to match what the plan required. My job was to measure viscosity, pH, solvent purity. I would draw a sample from the drum, run it through the test, and write the result in the logbook. The logbook had carbon copy pages. The top copy went to the production office. The bottom stayed in the lab. I never saw the top copy again. I don't know if anyone read it. I only know that I was supposed to confirm that the solvent was within specification, and that if it was not, I was supposed to record it anyway, and then the production office would decide what to do. I understood very early that my job was not to discover problems. My job was to document that no problems had been discovered. The party secretary came on Tuesdays. His name was Tovare Popescu. I don't remember his first name. I don't think I ever knew it. He walked the floor with a clipboard, not looking at anyone, stopping sometimes to stand in a doorway and watch for a moment before moving on. No one spoke to him. No one looked at him directly. We all knew he was there, and we all knew that the correct response to his presence was to continue working as if he were not. He never spoke to me. I never spoke to him. I don't think he knew my name, but I knew his. The union meetings were once a month. Attendance was mandatory. You signed in at the door, and if you were not there, someone would ask why the next day. The meetings followed a script I could have recited in my sleep. The production targets for the month, the socialist competition between brigades, the reading of a letter from the Central Committee. We sat and we listened and we did not speak. Silence was not just permitted, it was the correct form of participation. I remember once a man from the packaging division stood up and asked a question about the quality of the work gloves. He was not reprimanded. But the next week, his station was moved to a different part of the floor, and I never saw him at a meeting again. He was still there, of course. He just wasn't at the meetings. George Petrescu worked in the lab adjacent to mine. He was a chemical engineer, older than me, with a mustache and a habit of clearing his throat before he spoke. Everyone understood that he reported to someone. No one said this. No one could prove it. But we all knew, the way you know which floorboard creaks and which does not. You learned to speak around him. When he was in the room, the conversation became about the weather, about the tram schedule, about the price of bread. The real conversation waited until he had left. And if he had not left, the real conversation simply did not happen. I do not know what he wrote about us. I do not know if he wrote about me. But I know that I never said anything in front of him that I would not have said in front of a microphone. Outside the enterprise, the city was another kind of laboratory. 1983 in Cluj was a year of waiting. Waiting for power that came and went without schedule. Waiting for bread that sometimes arrived and sometimes did not. Waiting in queues that formed before dawn outside the Alimentara on Calea Dorobanshilor. I remember standing in one of those queues in February at 6 a.m, the cold seeping through my boots, the woman in front of me holding a string bag and a thermos of tea. We stood for 2 hours. The shop did not open. The delivery truck had not come. The woman with the thermos looked at me and said, "Tomorrow, maybe." And we all turned and walked home because there was nothing else to do. My mother and I shared the apartment on Strada Horia. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom with a water heater that worked when the electricity was on. We had developed a language for managing shortage without naming it. She would say, "I'll make soup tonight," and I would understand that the soup would be thinner than it should be because the carrots were not available. She would say, "We have enough sugar until Friday," and I would understand that we did not have enough sugar, but that she had calculated how to stretch it. We never complained. Complaining was a luxury. What we did instead was calculate. At 32, I wanted very simple things. I wanted to do my work well. I wanted to be left alone. I wanted to save enough for a television set, a small one, black and white, with a dial that clicked when you turned it. I wanted, perhaps, to one day have a room of my own in a slightly larger apartment. I did not want to escape. I did not want to be a hero. I wanted a kind of dignity inside the constraints, a way of living that was not humiliation. And I wanted not to be afraid. That was the one want I understood was unreasonable. Because in Romania in 1983, not being afraid was not a condition you could achieve. It was a condition you could only pretend to, and the pretending was itself a form of fear. I remember a Tuesday in March. I was at my bench measuring the pH of a batch of solvent that I knew was slightly acidic, not enough to fail the spec, but enough to be wrong. I recorded it as passing. I signed the logbook. And then I heard footsteps in the corridor, and I looked up, and it was not Tovare Popescu. It was my direct supervisor, the chief engineer, Vasile Ionescu. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not moving, and then he said my name, not loudly, just my name. And he said, "When your shift ends, please come to my office." I did not ask why. You did not ask why. You said yes, and you spent the rest of the shift trying to calculate what you had done wrong. I went through the day's work in my mind. The solvent that was slightly acidic. A conversation I had had at lunch about the price of bread. A joke someone had told that I had laughed at. I could not find the thing. I could not find the mistake. And that was worse, because if I did not know what I had done, I could not prepare for what he would say. I finished my shift. I washed my hands. I took off my lab coat and hung it on the hook by the door. I walked down the corridor to Ionescu's office. The door was closed. I knocked. He said, "Come in," and I opened the door and I stepped inside, and I did not know yet that this was the moment my ordinary life would stop being ordinary, and that what came next would take me somewhere I had not planned to go. I was at the bench running a viscosity test on batch 47C when I heard him. Not his footsteps. The corridor had that linoleum that swallowed sound, but the particular way the lab door opened. Not a push. A slow, deliberate pull, as if the person on the other side wanted to see the room before entering it. He said my name. Not Elena Munteanu, just my name, the way he always did when he wanted to be precise without being formal. Elena. When you finish the shift, come to my office, please. That word please was the problem. Ionescu never said please for routine things. He said please when he was asking for something that required cooperation, not obedience. And in a state enterprise in 1983, Cooperation was always more complicated than obedience. I spent the next 3 hours measuring viscosity and pH and recording numbers in the logbook, and I did it perfectly. Because when you are waiting for a summons you do not know the nature of, you perform competence as a form of protection. If you are good at your work, you reason, then whatever they want from you, they will have to account for the fact that you are useful. This is not true, but it is what you tell yourself. His office was a room that had been designed to communicate nothing. Green lamp on the desk, production chart on the wall, 2 chairs facing each other. The window looked onto the loading dock, which meant that at the end of shift you could hear the trucks starting up, the metal clatter of pallets. It was a room where you sat and waited for someone to tell you something, and you understood that the room itself was part of the message. This is an official conversation, but not one that requires a third person. He closed the door. Your name has been put forward, he said, for a technical exchange delegation to Vienna. Through the ministry. 5 days. A chemical industry conference. He spoke with his voice lowered slightly, not a whisper, but a register that was different from his ordinary speaking voice. I had heard that register before in other contexts. It was the voice people used when they were telling you something they were not supposed to tell you, or something they were not sure whether they were supposed to tell you. You would need to begin the documentation process, he said, if you are willing. And I sat there in the chair across from his desk, and I felt nothing. Not excitement, not gratitude. A blankness, like a room with the lights turned off. And then, immediately after the blankness, the question, what did I do wrong? Because that was the pattern. In Romania in 1983, if an institution singled you out, it was almost always because you had made a mistake. A form you had filled incorrectly, a signature you had missed, a remark someone had repeated. Being chosen for something good that required an explanation you did not have. Being chosen for something difficult that required only that you existed. I had to sit there in the green light of his lamp and consciously reorder my understanding of what he had just said. He was offering me something, not a punishment, not a test, an opportunity. Why me? I asked. He told me I had the right technical profile, that the delegation needed someone from quality control, that my record was clean. I believed him, mostly. But I also understood that a clean record in Romania in 1983 was not a neutral description. It was a verdict rendered by people I had never met, about information I was not permitted to see. My selection was as much their decision as Ionescu's, and I did not know who they were or what they had decided about me or why. I said yes. I said yes because I wanted to go to Vienna, because I wanted to see a city that was not this one, even for 5 days, because I wanted to be, for a moment, a person who existed in a world that was not organized around the management of shortage and the performance of compliance. But I said yes also because I understood that saying no would have required an explanation. And any explanation I gave would have been examined, and the examination would have produced questions, and the questions would have produced a different kind of attention than the attention I was already receiving. Saying no was not a refusal of the trip. Saying no was a refusal of the system that had selected me. And I was not brave enough for that. I am 66 years old now. I have had 30 years to think about that afternoon in Ionescu's office. And I still do not know whether I was chosen because I was suitable, or because I was convenient, or because someone in the ministry needed to fill a quota for women in technical delegations, or because my file, the file I did not know existed, contained a notation that made me acceptable to someone I will never meet. What I know is that I sat in that chair and I said yes, and that the word itself changed something. Not the trip did not happen, as you will learn, but the saying of yes, the moment of consent, the decision to accept what was offered, even though I did not understand why it was offered to me. That is what I remember most clearly from that day. Not the green lamp, not the production chart, not Ionescu's careful voice. The moment when I opened my mouth and let the word out and felt it land in the room between us and understood that I had just agreed to something I could not yet name. Ionescu nodded. He said he would begin the paperwork. He said someone from personnel would contact me in the next few days. And then he said, "You will need a passport." He said it as if it were a practical detail, a matter of administration. But the word hung in the air between us, a passport, a document I had never held. A document that, in Romania in 1983, was not a right but a privilege, granted by the same institution that could revoke it without explanation. I walked out of his office and down the corridor, past the mop bucket, past the closed doors, past the window that showed the loading dock now empty of trucks. And I thought I will need a passport. I did not know then that the passport would become the center of everything, that it would be given to me and taken from me, and that I would spend years wondering why. That the document itself would become a symbol of something I could not articulate, a question I could not answer. I did not know any of that. I only knew that I was walking down a corridor in a factory in Cluj, and that somewhere in Vienna there was a conference I might attend, and that between me and that conference there was a passport I did not have. And I thought, what will I have to do to get it? I brought them home in a manila envelope, the kind we use for internal memos at the Enterprise. 12 pages. The biographical questionnaire. I spread them across the kitchen table, under the lamp with the frayed cord, and I sat down. My mother was already asleep in the next room. I could hear her breathing through the thin wall, that soft, regular sound I had known my whole life. The forms were dense. Tight questions, small boxes, lines for signatures. The ink on the printed questions was black and official. My handwriting, when I started to fill them in, was careful. Too careful at first. I had to start the first page over because my hand was trembling and the E in Elena came out wrong, the loop too large, like a child's writing. The form asked for my father's date of death, 1971. That was straightforward. My mother's occupation, retired seamstress. No party membership, no complications. Then came the section for second-degree relatives. And there it was, the box for my mother's brother, Uncle Gihog. I had not seen him since 1968. He had emigrated to West Germany through a family reunification scheme. I wrote his name in the box. Then I wrote the city Cool. I sat looking at what I had written for a long time. The pen was still in my hand. I could feel the weight of it. I did not know whether honesty was safer than omission. I did not know whether it made any difference at all. I thought about erasing it. I thought about writing deceased. He was not deceased. But how would they know? But they would know. They always knew. Or they might not know, and that was worse, because if they did not know and I told them, I had given them information they did not have. And if they did know and I did not tell them, I had lied. I left it. I left coal in the box. I moved to the next page. The forms asked everything. Where I had been on the 1st of January 1978. Who I had spoken to at the union meeting in March 1980. Whether I had ever listened to foreign radio broadcasts. The correct answer to that one was no. It was also the true answer. I had never owned a shortwave radio, and the one time a colleague had mentioned hearing the BBC, I had left the room before he could tell me what he had heard. I did not want to know. Ignorance was a kind of protection. I filled in the forms at the kitchen table for 3 nights. Each night my handwriting became more careful. Each night I understood more clearly that every word I wrote was being read by someone I would never see. Someone who would compare my answers to other answers. Someone who would decide, based on the shape of my letters and the completeness of my boxes, whether I was trustworthy. Then came the interviews. Doamna Florescu was the personnel officer. She was in her 40s, with reading glasses on a gold chain. She sat behind a metal desk in a small room with filing cabinets along one wall. The room smelled of carbon paper and floor wax. She asked me questions from a printed list. Her tone was neither hostile nor warm. It was precisely bureaucratic. She asked about my daily routine. I told her. She asked about my social contacts. I told her I had few. She asked whether I listened to foreign radio broadcasts. I said no. She asked whether I had ever been approached by anyone asking about my workplace. I said no. She wrote down my answers. She did not look at me while she wrote. She looked at the paper. I sat in the chair across from her desk and I gave the answers that were true and also the answers that were safe. In this case, they were the same answers. I understood that this was luck. There was a second interview, a week later. Same room, same chair, but this time there was a man I did not know sitting in the corner. He did not introduce himself. He did not speak. He just sat there in a dark suit watching. Doamna Florescu asked the same questions, or similar ones. I gave the same answers. The man in the corner did not write anything down. He just watched. I kept my hands flat on my knees. I did not look at him. I looked at Doamna Florescu's glasses, at the chain, at the way the light caught the metal. I answered the questions. When it was over, I stood up. I said thank you. I walked out. I did not run. I walked down the corridor, past the filing cabinets, past the door with the frosted glass, out into the courtyard. I stood in the courtyard for a moment. The air was cold. I realized I had been holding my breath. What were the forms really measuring? Not my biography. They already knew my biography. They had my file. They had my father's death certificate. They had my mother's employment record. They had the name of my uncle in Köln, probably, before I wrote it down. The forms were measuring something else. They were measuring my relationship to the system. Whether I understood the implicit rules, whether I could be trusted to go to Vienna and come back, whether I had the specific kind of loyalty that was not enthusiasm but compliance. I understood this, sitting at my kitchen table. I understood that I was being asked to perform a kind of self-surveillance, to see myself through the eyes of the Securitate and confirm that what they saw was acceptable. to write my own report on myself and hand it in. And I did it. I filled in the boxes. I wrote the answers. I signed my name at the bottom of each page. I did it because I wanted to go to Vienna. I did it because I was afraid not to. I did it because I had been doing this my whole life, in one form or another, and I no longer knew where the performance ended, and I began. The forms were returned to the enterprise. I did not see them again. I did not ask. I waited. I went to work. I measured viscosity. I recorded pH levels. I did not tell anyone about the interviews. I did not tell anyone about the man in the dark suit. I came home at night and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the empty space where the forms had been. My mother asked me once carefully how the process was going. I said it was fine. She nodded. She did not ask again. We understood each other. I am still not sure what I would have done if the answers had not been the same, if the safe answer had been different from the true one. I think about that sometimes. I think about the box from my uncle's city. I think about the man in the dark suit. I think about the forms and the handwriting and the way I sat at that table for 3 nights performing a version of myself that I hoped was acceptable. And I wonder if they had asked me something I could not answer honestly and safely both, what would I have written? What would I have done? I do not know. I still do not know. And that, I think, is the thing the forms were really asking. Not where I had been, not who I knew, but whether I knew how to choose. And I did not know then, and I am not sure I know now. The administration building had a different smell from the lab. No solvents, no acetone. Just old paper and floor wax and the radiator clicking in the corner. I had been in that building maybe 3 times in 11 years. Once to sign my employment contract. Once to collect a bonus certificate that turned out to be a framed piece of paper and nothing else. And now this. The woman at the desk was someone I did not know. She had a nameplate, Doamna Rudulescu, something in personnel, but I had never seen her before. She did not smile. She did not frown. She slid a booklet across the desk to me as if she were passing me a library book. Dark blue cover. Gold lettering, Romanian passport. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. I opened it, and there was my face, black and white, the photograph I had taken at the studio on Strada Memorandumului 3 weeks earlier. My name typed underneath, Elena Munteanu. The passport number. The words, valabil pentru o singuri călătorie, valid for a single trip. I did not feel joy. That is the honest thing to say. I felt something else, a kind of unreality, as if the object in my hands belonged to a version of myself I had not yet earned the right to be. I had never held a passport before. I had never needed one. I had never imagined that my face could be inside a document that said I was permitted to leave. Doamna Ardulescu said, "You will not keep this at home." I looked up. "It will be held here in the enterprise safe. You will receive it on the morning of your departure, and you will return it the evening of your return." This is standard procedure. I nodded. I said I understood. And I did understand. Everyone understood. The passport was a permission, not a possession. The distance between those 2 words was the distance between a citizen and a subject. I had lived my whole life on one side of that distance. I knew exactly where I was standing. She told me the date, April 27th, 1983. Departure from Bucharest, flight to Vienna. 5 days, a conference on industrial solvent standards. I would be accompanied by 2 other delegates from the enterprise and the ministry liaison whose name she did not give me. I put the passport back on the desk. She picked it up, opened a drawer, placed it inside, closed the drawer, locked it with a key from the chain around her neck. I walked back to the lab. I do not remember the corridor. I do not remember the stairs. I remember the door to the lab, the way I pushed it open, the way the air changed back to solvents and glass, and the familiar hum of the fume hood. My bench, my logbook, my viscometer, everything exactly as I had left it. I finished my shift. I recorded the pH readings. I signed the logbook. I washed my hands at the sink, the same cracked white sink I had used for 11 years. The tram home was crowded. I stood near the back holding the metal pole, watching the buildings slide past. The same buildings I had seen every day for as long as I could remember, the same gray, the same cracks in the plaster. The same laundry hanging from balconies. My mother was in the kitchen when I got home. She was peeling potatoes at the sink, the television on in the living room, the evening news, the same voice reading the same announcements. I sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at me over her shoulder. I said quietly, "I have something to tell you." She turned off the water. She dried her hands on her apron. She sat down across from me. I told her, the passport, the trip, Vienna, April 27th. She did not say anything for a moment. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking at the tablecloth, the same oilcloth we had had since 1975, the pattern worn away in the center where our plates sat every night. Then she looked up and said, "Will you be able to bring back a pair of stockings?" I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was practical. Because my mother had spent 30 years managing shortage, and her mind had gone immediately to the things we could not get. Stockings, aspirin. The pharmacy on Calea Dorobansilor had not had aspirin in 3 weeks. "Yes," I said, "I can bring stockings." "And aspirin." She nodded. She picked up another potato. "I have thought about that passport for 14 years. Not every day, but often. The fact that it existed, that it had my face in it, that it was real, and that it was kept in a drawer I could not open. That is what I think about when I think about Romania in 1983. Not the queues, not the shortages, not the informers. The passport in the drawer. The proof of your own potential freedom, administered by someone else, available to you only under conditions they controlled. I went to bed that night with the date in my head, April 27th. I said it to myself in the dark, April 27th. I did not know then that I would never get on that plane. I remember the weeks after the passport was put in the safe as a kind of double living. I would be at my bench in the lab, watching the mercury thread climb the thermometer, writing down the viscosity numbers in the logbook, and at the same time I would be somewhere else entirely. I was walking down a street I had never seen, past buildings I knew only from a postcard my uncle had sent in 1967. The Stephansdom, yes, but also the ordinary streets, the ones with shops and cafes and people who were not queuing for anything. The postcard had been in a drawer in my mother's bedroom for 16 years. The image had faded, the colors gone soft and yellowed, but I had looked at it so many times that I had filled in the details myself. I had built a city from almost nothing. There was a photograph too. A colleague, a woman from the packaging division whose name I have forgotten now, had brought in a West German magazine once, a copy of Der Spiegel from someone's relative in Munich. She passed it around the lab quickly, under the bench, and I saw a photograph of the Nashmar. Stalls of fruit and vegetables arranged in pyramids, colors I had not seen together in a single place in years, red peppers, yellow lemons, green apples. I looked at it for maybe 10 seconds before I passed it on, but I kept it in my mind. I kept it like a secret. And there was the novel, Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, in a Romanian translation from 1960. I had bought it from a second-hand bookshop on Strada Universității for 3 lei. The spine was cracked, the pages had that smell of old paper and dust, and there was a passage about a coffee house on the Ringstrasse where the waiter knew your name and brought you your usual without asking. I read that passage so many times that I could have recited it. I knew it was a fantasy. I knew the Vienna of 1914 was not the Vienna of 1983. But the fantasy was not about the city. The fantasy was about being in a place where I could walk into a room and not have to calculate in advance what I was allowed to say. I let myself prepare small things. A suitcase from the Romarta shop on Piața Unirii, brown vinyl, the best they had, which was not very good. The clasps were cheap chrome that left a mark on your fingers. The handle was plastic, molded to look like leather, and it creaked when you lifted it. I brought it home and put it on my bed and opened it, and I stood looking at the empty interior for a long time. I had never owned a suitcase before. I had never been anywhere that required one. I found a blouse in a second-hand shop near the Central Market, white, with a small collar and buttons down the front. It was not new, but it was clean, and it seemed to me, I cannot explain this better, it seemed to me to look less Romanian than my other clothes. The fabric was different. The cut was different. I bought it and I folded it into the suitcase, and I felt for a moment like someone who was going somewhere. I went to the Banca Romania de Comeria exterior on the main square and exchanged the maximum amount of lei permitted. I do not remember the exact figure now, but it was small, for Austrian shillings. The teller counted them out slowly, as if each note was a concession. I put them in an envelope and put the envelope in the suitcase, under the blouse. I calculated later that it would buy me perhaps 2 meals and a small gift. I told almost no one, not my colleagues, not the neighbors, not even my mother, at first not the full details. I told her only that I was going, and that I would bring her stockings and aspirin. She nodded. She did not ask questions. She understood, as I understood, that in Romania in 1983, any unusual good fortune attracted a particular quality of attention. Not envy exactly, something more careful. People looked at you differently if you had something they did not. They measured you. They wondered how you had come by it, and whether you deserved it, and whether they might have it too if they watched you closely enough. I did not want to be watched. I did not want to be visible. Visible was dangerous. I thought about Vienna constantly. Not the conference. I did not think about the conference at all. I thought about the experience of being in a place where the air was not organized by the state, where I could walk into a shop and see what was in it without a queue, where I could sit in a cafe and order something without knowing in advance whether it would be available, where I could walk down a street and no one would ask me where I was going, or why, or when I would be back. I knew even then that this was a fantasy. I knew the West had its own difficulties. I had read enough, heard enough to understand that Vienna was not paradise. But the fantasy was not about the West. The fantasy was about the feeling of being, briefly unaccounted for, of existing for a few days in a world that did not require me to account for my movements, my choices, my thoughts, of being, for a moment, not a subject. I kept the suitcase under my bed. I opened it sometimes, at night, when my mother was asleep. I touched the blouse. I counted the shillings. I looked at the postcard from my uncle, which I had taken from her drawer without asking. The Stephansdom, the ordinary streets, a city I had assembled from almost nothing. And then, 4 days before I was supposed to leave, Ionescu appeared at the lab door again. He did not look at me when he spoke. He said my name, and then he said he would like to see me in his office at the end of the shift. The same words as before, the same tone. But the way he did not look at me, that was different, that was new. I spent the rest of the day at my bench, measuring viscosity, recording pH levels, writing numbers in the logbook. My hands did the work. My mind was already in his office, receiving what I already knew. I saw him before he saw me. Ionescu. He was at the far end of the corridor walking toward the lab door, and he hadn't looked in yet. But I knew. There was a particular way he didn't look at you when the news was bad. His eyes would go to the doorframe, to the floor just past your feet, to the production chart on the wall behind you. He would arrive at your face only when he had to, and then he would hold your gaze exactly as long as the message required and no longer. He appeared at the door at 10 in the morning. Doamna Munteanu, he said. At the end of your shift, please. My office. The same words as the first time. But this time his gaze was already past me, already on the instrument shelf behind my shoulder. I said yes, of course, and he turned and walked back down the corridor, and I stood there at the bench with my hand on the viscometer, and I understood that whatever he was going to tell me, I already knew it. I worked the rest of the shift. I tested a batch of solvent for viscosity. I recorded the results in the logbook. I cleaned the glassware. My hands did everything they were supposed to do. But there was a part of my mind that had already left my body and was sitting in Ionescu's office waiting for me. And it was telling me, the passport is gone, the trip is gone, you are not going to Vienna. You are going home tonight, and tomorrow you will come back here, and everything will be exactly as it was before March, and you will pretend that nothing happened, because that is what you do. At 5 o'clock I took off my lab coat, hung it on the hook by the door, and walked to Ionescu's office. The door was open. He was at his desk, the green lamp already on, though the light outside was still good. He gestured to the chair across from him. I sat. He closed the door. There has been a modification in the composition of the delegation, he said. He spoke carefully, as if reading from a document that was not in front of him. Your participation is no longer confirmed. This is a decision from the ministry level. It is not a reflection on your work or your record. I am sorry. I will need to take back the documentation you were given. He did not look at me when he said he was sorry. He looked at his hands, and I recognized his face. It was the face of a man delivering a message he had not written and would not be asked to explain. A man who was the instrument of something larger than himself, and who knew it, and who had accepted it long ago. I had seen that face many times. I had worn it myself. When the system required me to be its instrument, to tell a colleague that their request was denied, to record a result that was not quite accurate because the norm said it should be, I had made that same face. The face of a person who is not responsible, but who is present. And then I did what I had known I would do. I reached into my bag and took out the folder with the exit visa documentation. The forms I had filled out at the kitchen table, the declaration of family relationships, the 12-page biographical questionnaire. I placed them on his desk. I did not open the folder. I did not look at my own handwriting one last time. I pushed the folder across the surface toward him, and he took it, and the transaction was complete. The passport was already gone. I had not even brought it home. It had been in the Enterprise safe since the day I received it, and I understood now that it was back in that safe, or perhaps further, back to wherever passports went when they were revoked. The transaction was so clean, so administratively complete, that it felt less like a punishment than like a correction. As if my name had been entered in a column by mistake, and someone had noticed, and now it was being erased. And I was expected to accept the correction as reasonable, because I had no standing to call it anything else. I did not ask why. I did not say, what did I do? I did not say, who made this decision? I did not say any of the things that a person in a different country, a different system, might have said. Because asking why was not a thing you did in Romania in 1983 when an institution revised its decision about you. Asking why was itself a kind of accusation. It implied that the decision required justification. It made you visible. It made you problematic. It made you the kind of person whose passport should be revoked. So I said I understood. I thanked him. He stood up. I walked out of his office, down the corridor, past the empty lab, past the security desk at the main entrance, and out into the courtyard. The loading dock was empty. The light was still good. The sky was a pale April blue, the same sky that would be over Vienna in 4 days, and I stood there for a moment, and I did not cry, because crying was also a kind of visibility, and I had already decided that I would not be visible. I took the tram home. I climbed the stairs to the apartment. My mother was in the kitchen peeling potatoes over the sink. She looked at me when I came in, and she must have seen something in my face, because she put down the peeler and sat down at the table without saying anything. I sat down across from her. The trip, I said, it's cancelled. She nodded. She did not ask why. She did not ask what happened. She was a woman who had lived through the war, through the early years of the regime, through the death of my father. She knew that some questions did not have answers that would help you. She knew that the only useful response to a door closing was to turn around and find another door, or to accept that no door was needed, that the room you were in was enough. She said after a moment, it was probably for the best. Vienna is far. The enterprise needs you." And I nodded because I understood what she was doing. She was performing the same adjustment I was performing, the recalibration of expectation back to the level the system permitted, the level we had both lived at for our entire adult lives, the level where a passport was a permission, not a possession, where a trip to Vienna was a dream you were allowed to have for 6 weeks and then you gave it back. I went to bed early that night. I lay in the dark and I thought about the suitcase, the brown vinyl one from the Romata shop. I had bought it 3 days earlier. I had put it on top of the wardrobe, empty, waiting. I thought about the blouse I had bought in the second-hand shop, the one that looked less Romanian. I thought about the Austrian shillings in the envelope in my drawer, enough for 2 meals and a small gift. I thought about all the small, careful preparations I had made for a journey that was not going to happen. And I thought about what I would do tomorrow. I would go back to the enterprise. I would put on my lab coat. I would test the viscosity of solvent. I would record the results in the logbook. I would clean the glassware. I would go home. I would do it again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. And I would not tell anyone what had happened. Because what was there to tell? A correction had been made. A name had been erased. The column was clean now. And I had no standing to call it anything else. But I lay there in the dark and I asked myself the question I would not ask Ionescu. The question I would not ask anyone for years. Why? What did I do? Who told them? Was it the uncle in Köln? Was it a remark I made once in the lab about a broadcast I had not admitted to hearing? Was it Gheorghe Petrescu writing his careful reports in the office I never saw? Or was it nothing, a quota from the ministry, a political shift above my level, a bureaucratic accident that had nothing to do with me at all? I did not know. I do not know now, 14 years later. And that is the thing I carried home from Ionescu's office that evening, heavier than the passport I never held again. The question without an answer. The door that closed without a sound and left me standing on this side of it, wondering if I had closed it myself. The tram was the same wooden seats, the same worn metal handrails, the same smell of damp wool and diesel fumes. I sat in my usual place near the window and I watched the city pass, the same streets, the same buildings, the same grey morning light. Nothing had changed. That was the thing that struck me most. I had been carrying something for 6 weeks, something that had made the world feel different, and now it was gone and the world had not noticed. The tram stopped at the same stop. I got off at the same gate. I showed my pass to the same guard. The lab was exactly as I had left it. The log books were on the same shelf. The viscometer was on the same bench. The pH meter was calibrated, the glassware was clean, and the morning samples were waiting in their numbered racks. I put on my lab coat. I sat down at my bench. I picked up the first sample and began to measure its viscosity, and I wrote the results in the logbook in the same handwriting I had used for 11 years. It took a specific effort to make my hand move normally, not to hesitate, not to press the pen too hard into the paper. To make the numbers look like they had always looked. I suppose that was the real work of those days. Not the measuring, not the recording, the performance of ordinariness. the effort of making yourself indistinguishable from the person you had been before. Because grief over a revoked passport was not a grief you could display. There was no form for it, no ritual. No one would say, "I'm sorry for your loss," because what had I lost? A trip, a possibility, a version of myself I had not yet become. You could not mourn that in public. You could not even name it in private without feeling foolish. 3 days later, I watched them leave. I was standing at the window of the quality control lab on the second floor. I had not planned to watch. I had been measuring a sample, and I looked up, and there it was, a black ministry car pulling into the courtyard. 2 of my colleagues came out of the administration building. One was a man from the engineering division I barely knew. The other was a woman from the accounting office whose name I have forgotten now, though I remember her coat, a dark blue one, slightly too large for her. They carried a suitcase between them. Ionescu came out last. He was wearing his good coat, the dark grey one he wore only for meetings with the ministry. He stood at the gate and watched the car approach. He did not look up at the window. The car stopped. The driver got out and opened the boot. The 2 colleagues loaded the suitcase. They got into the back seat. Ionescu stood for a moment longer, then got into the front passenger seat. The car pulled away. The gate closed behind it. The courtyard was empty again. And that was it. That was the end. The courtyard returned to its ordinary configuration. People crossed it. A truck backed up to the loading dock. Someone swept the entrance. For everyone except me, nothing had happened. And I had to live with that, the knowledge that I was the only person in the world for whom this particular thing had happened, and that the world did not require me to have a reaction to it. That evening my mother asked, carefully. She was sitting at the kitchen table mending a sleeve, and she did not look up when she said, "Has the trip been postponed?" "Cancelled," I said. She nodded. She kept sewing. For a moment she said nothing. Then she said, "It's probably for the best. Vienna is far. The enterprise needs you." And I understood. She was not being callous. She was performing the same adjustment I was performing. The recalibration of expectation back to the level the system permitted. The level we had both lived at for our entire adult lives. She had done it before, many times. She had learned to want only what was available and to stop wanting what was not, and she was teaching me to do the same in the only way she knew how. I did not unpack the suitcase. I put it in the storage space under the bed, still packed, the blouse I had bought, the envelope of shillings I never spent, the small bag of toiletries I had assembled, all of it still inside. I left it there for 3 weeks. I am not entirely sure why. Perhaps because unpacking it was an admission that the trip was not going to happen, that the possibility I had been carrying was gone, that the suitcase would never be used for what I had bought it for. Or perhaps I needed those 3 weeks to finish grieving something I was not supposed to have been grieving in the first place. When I finally opened it, I took out the blouse. I folded it. I put it in the back of my wardrobe. I took out the envelope of shillings. I put it in a drawer. I took out the toiletries and put them in the bathroom cabinet. And that was the end of it, officially. But officially is not the same as actually. And the question I have never answered, the question I still do not know the answer to, is why? Why was I removed from the delegation? Who told them something? Or was it nothing to do with me at all? I have lived with that question for 14 years. I have turned it over in my mind like a stone that never warms in your hand. And I am still holding it. I have thought about the question every day for 14 years. Not continuously, that would be impossible, but it arrives at certain times. When I wake at 3 in the morning and cannot go back to sleep. When I see someone on the street whose face I almost recognize. When I open the storage space and see the brown suitcase that never went anywhere. The question is not complicated. It is very simple. Who told them and what did they say? Or did anyone tell them anything at all? I do not know. I have lived with not knowing for so long that the not knowing has become its own kind of answer. But it is not a satisfactory one. In 1996, I went to Bucharest. I took the train from Cluj, 3 hours, second class, the same route I had taken for work trips to the ministry in the old days. The CNSA's building is on Calea Victoriae, near the old palace of the Patriotic Guard. I had applied by mail. I had waited 8 months. When I arrived, a woman at the front desk checked my identity card against a list and directed me to a reading room on the second floor. The room was ordinary. A table, a lamp, a window that looked out onto a courtyard. Another person was there, a man in his 50s, reading a file of his own. We did not speak. The researcher brought my file in a cardboard folder. 23 pages. She placed it on the table in front of me and said I could take notes but could not photocopy anything. Then she sat at her desk and resumed reading a book. I opened the folder. My name was there, my address, my mother's name. My father's name, deceased. The uncle in Cole, listed as a foreign relative. And then the reports. The subject was observed arriving at the Enterprise at 7:42. The subject made no contact with foreign nationals during the observation period. The subject's demeanor was unremarkable. I read those words and I felt something I cannot name. Because I had been watched, someone had written about me. Someone had sat somewhere, in a car, in an office, in a room I will never see, and typed those sentences. And the sentences said I was unremarkable, which should have been a relief, but it was not. Because the watching itself was the point. The watching had happened regardless of what I did. 23 pages. Large sections blacked out. References to a source identified by a code name I did not recognize. Nothing that explained the revocation, nothing that said this person reported this thing, and therefore your passport was taken. The file confirmed surveillance. It did not confirm consequence. And so the question remained exactly where it had always been. I saw George Petrescu once after the revolution. It was 1992, I think, or 1993. I was walking past the Enterprise. I had not worked there since 1989. I had found a job at a private laboratory, and he was coming out of the gate. He was older. His hair had gone gray. He was wearing the same kind of coat he had always worn, a brown one with a missing button on the collar. He saw me. I saw him. We both looked away. That is the whole encounter. 2 seconds perhaps. We did not speak. We have never spoken. And I do not know if he reported anything about me. I do not know if he was a source with the code name I did not recognize. I do not know if he was anyone at all. He may have been exactly what he seemed, a laboratory technician who kept his head down and said nothing to anyone. Or he may have been the reason I never saw Vienna. The system that made us what we were, me into a subject, him into a source or not a source, is gone. The party is gone. The Securitate is gone. The enterprise has been privatized and half demolished. But the relationship that system created between us is still there. In the space between two people who cannot speak to each other about the only thing they share. I have thought about that moment many times. I will probably think about it for the rest of my life. Because the uncertainty is, in some ways, worse than either answer would be. If I knew that George Petrescu had reported something about me, I could hate him. That would be clean. If I knew that no one had reported anything, that it was a bureaucratic accident, a quota reduction, a political shift above my level, I could accept that. That would be clean too. But I do not know. And so I live with a question that has no answer, and I have learned to carry it, but I have not learned to put it down. I still have the suitcase, the brown vinyl one from the Romarta shop on Piazza Uniri. I have never used it for travel. It sits in the storage space of the apartment I now have to myself since my mother died in 1991. I keep winter blankets in it. I am aware that this is either symbolic or simply practical, and I am no longer sure which, and I am no longer sure it matters. But I think about it sometimes when I open the storage space. I think about what it would have meant to be, for 5 days, a person who existed in a world not organized around my compliance. And I think about the almost experience I carry instead, which is a different kind of thing, thinner, with a different weight. I do not know who told them. I do not know if anyone told them. And I have come to understand that the question itself is part of what the system left behind. Not just the surveillance, not just the revoked passport, not just the lost trip, but the uncertainty. The permanent, unresolvable uncertainty about what was done to you and who did it and whether it was done at all. That is what I carry, and I will carry it until I die. I still have the suitcase, the brown vinyl one from the Romarta shop on Piazza Uniri. It's in the storage space now, the little closet off the kitchen in this apartment. After my mother died in 1991, I had the place to myself and I kept it. I don't know why. I've never used it for travel. I use it to store winter blankets. I am aware that this is either symbolic or simply practical, and I am no longer sure which, and I am no longer sure it matters. I want to be precise about something. I did not denounce anyone. I did not inform on my colleagues. I did not join the party. But I also did not resist. I filled in the forms carefully. I gave the safe answers. I performed the loyalty the system required of me in exchange for the ordinary life it permitted me to have. I want to be precise about this because I have seen, in the years since 1989, a tendency among people of my generation to remember themselves as having been more resistant than they were. I do not want to do that. I want to tell the truth. The truth is that I was compliant in all the small ways that allowed the system to function. This is not the same as being a collaborator, but it is not the same as being innocent either. I think about what the trip to Vienna would have meant. Not that my life would have been different. I do not believe that. I am 66 years old and I am a realist. But I would have had the experience of being, for 5 days, a person who existed in a world that was not organized around my compliance. And that experience, even as a memory, would have been something to carry. The thing I carry instead is the memory of the almost experience. It is a different kind of thing, thinner, with a different weight. I have thought about who told them, or if anyone told them at all. I have thought about whether it was my uncle in Kel, written on that form in my careful handwriting. Whether it was a remark I made once about the Radio Free Europe broadcast I had not admitted to hearing. Whether it was George Petrescu, the man in the lab who everyone understood reported informally to someone, or whether it was nothing, a quota reduction from the ministry, a political shift above my level, a bureaucratic accident. I went to the CNSAS archive in Bucharest in 1996. I sat at a table with 23 pages in front of me. Significant sections redacted in black ink, references to a source identified only by a code name I did not recognize. My own name in typed reports written by someone who had watched me and described me in the third person. The subject was observed arriving at the Enterprise at 7042. The subject made no contact with foreign nationals. The subject's demeanor was unremarkable. I did not find the document that explained the revocation directly. The file confirmed surveillance without confirming its consequence. The central question stayed exactly where it had always been. I have made a kind of peace with not knowing, not because it stopped mattering, but because I understood finally that the not knowing was itself the system's last instruction. To remain uncertain, to remain a subject, to carry the question without an answer for the rest of your life. I have not said any of this to anyone, not in 14 years. Not to my mother before she died, not to the friends I still have from the Enterprise. Not to myself really, not in words, because to say it is to admit that I was not a hero, that I was not a victim, that I was someone who made the small, reasonable choices that kept her safe, and that those choices were also the choices that kept the system running. I do not know if I was betrayed. I do not know if I betrayed myself. I do not know if the revocation was political or bureaucratic or personal or random. But I am sitting here in this chair, in this apartment, in this city in 1997, and I am telling you this. Not because I have an answer, but because by saying it, I am at last refusing the instruction